welcome to our webinar on steps for migrating to Team Developer 5.2. And before we get started and I introduce our speaker today, I want to review a few housekeeping items. So for those of you new to Unify Corporation, we're a publicly traded software company that's been in business for over 30 years. We're known for being the first to deliver a relational database in the Unix environment. And since then, we've delivered development software products that run across different databases and platforms, really geared towards building and modernizing business applications, and really to the business application developer who places a premium on productivity over low-level coding. Today, our business has expanded beyond the tools and database products into migration solutions as well as email archiving. Now, we encourage questions on the webinar, and the way you do that is to use the Q&A button on your WebEx toolbar. It's the button that usually you see the toolbar in the bottom right-hand corner, and then the Q&A button is the button with the question mark. There's also a chat button, but it really makes it easier for Anna and I to look in one panel for the questions to make sure we address all of them. So, speaking of Anna, today's presenter is Anna Paula Bonanni. Anna is our Director of Technical Support worldwide, and has been with Unify for over, is it 11 years or 12 years yet?
11 years.
11 years. Basically in various technical roles, including support, consulting, she's done kind of both pre-sales and post-sales. She was the first technical resource in our Brazil office, so she basically helped open it. And she's spent a lot of time working with team developer customers since 1.1.2,
yes,
I think.
That's correct.
She's gone through all the name changes of Team Developer, all the releases, the versions. She's seen a lot. So it's a great opportunity and a real treat to really have someone with her background and experience on TD who has worked on all these customer projects presenting today. Just a moment on this subject. We see a lot of new names on the webinar today, which is great. But just in case some of you are returning webinar viewers, we've done a migration webinar like this for 5.1, but with the release of 5.2 and the service pack, we've got a lot of people that who haven't gone through the migration steps before, or they haven't tried since one of the early service packs in 5.1, and so you'll see if you've gone to the previous migration webinars, it's very similar in going to 5.2, but since there's so many new people doing it now, we thought it'd be good to do a refresh on the topic. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Anna to begin the presentation.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. As Matt said, this is the same webinar that we've done for Team Developer 5.1, but we had lots of new attendees on this webinar, so I believe that it's the first time that most of you will be seeing this presentation. So let's go ahead and check our agenda for today. We're going to go through a small checklist. Those are items that you would need to check before starting your migration, and we'll cover them. Right after that, we'll cover the steps for migrating your Team Developer outline from any version. It doesn't matter if you're coming even from a 16-bit application directly to Team Developer 5.2. At the end of this webinar, we'll do a quick overview of the Unicode changes that happened in TD 5.x, so you are aware of them, and you can check your code, check your outline for any new features related to Unicode that you need to implement or change in your application for a successful migration. And we will open for question and answers. Matt explained how to do them. So let's go ahead and get started. Our checklist. As I mentioned before, it doesn't matter if you're even coming from a 16-bit SQL Windows application. You can go directly to Team Developer 5.2. But we do have a white paper available for you. And if you're migrating from 16-bit SQL Windows or Team Developer 1.5, for instance, we strongly recommend that you look at this white paper because it has lots of information on things that changed from the 16-bit to the 32-bit SQL Windows and then changes that happen all the way from Team Developer 1.5 to 5.x. So it's really important that you take a look. I have a link to this white paper on the slide. It's available on our website. So it's important to know a few things. For instance, when we changed from Team Developer 1.5 to 3.1, at the time Gupta, we made lots of changes in the application outline, in Team Developer outline. We also deprecated some functions and added new features. So, for instance, quick OLAP functions were deprecated in Team Developer 3.1. So, if you're coming from a version previous to 3.1, it's really important that you understand those functions and how to replace them. So when you go to Team Developer 5.2, you're ready for your migration. We also made a change related to non-editable data fields. If you remember correctly, and if you're coming from an old version of TD, we would allow non-editable data fields to be tabbed, and this changed in Team Developer 3.1 as well. So you have to be aware of that change before going straight to Team Developer 5.2 so you understand how it works in this new version. And we also made ActiveX, COM changes, new implementations. So take a look at this white paper, check for these changes. If your application code uses one of those features, please go ahead and make the changes before initiating your migration to Team Developer 5.2. Also, for 5.2, because of the Unicode changes, it's very important that you ensure that your migration will happen on a machine which has the same local code page where the application was written on. This is important mostly for double byte character languages like Japanese. So if you're migrating a Japanese TD application, then you will have to ensure that you migrate from a machine with the same local code page where this application was written on. This is to avoid Unicode conflict. Another item that I always say for users migrating as a very important item on the checklist is to make sure that you have a backup of your original application. And this may sound silly, but as a support person, I know that many times we just skip that step and then we get ourselves into trouble. So this is a very important item as well. Make a backup of your original application so you can refer to it if you need to. Okay, so let's start our steps for migration. And again, this is for migrating your outline. Those steps are required. They're not recommended only, they are required. So if you're initiating your migration right now, as I said, independent of which application outline you're coming from, please make sure to start from step 1 and follow all the way through. So the first step is to create a build environment for the original application from where you can compile and run successfully. So what I mean is, for instance, if you're migrating your application from TD 2.1, you will need to have an environment where you know that your Team Developer 2.1 application compiles and runs successfully. Because if you have that, you will avoid frustration when you go to Team Developer 5.2 and you don't understand why you have an error on your application. So ensure that the original application compiles and runs successfully on the machine where you're doing the migration. The second step is to copy the original source into a conversion directory. So at this point, you're doing your backup. You have an original directory, you have an original folder with your original application, and one folder that will be your target folder for the migration outline, migrated outline. Install Team Developer 5.2, of course, and Team Developer 5.2 can coexist with previous TD versions. The only thing you have to be aware of is that it has to be located on a different folder from another TD version, and it has to be set in the path. We do that when we install our wizard, installation wizard does that by default. It sets TD on the path, but make sure you take a look and make sure it's there, and preferably before your other TD versions. And install Service Pack 1. We just released Service Pack 1 for Team Developer 5.2. It has lots of fixes. It has a few new features as well. So go to our website under our downloads page, download our service pack, install it on top of your Team Developer 5.2 installation before proceeding with the outline migration. Okay, so after you've done that, our fifth step is to ensure that your applications folder doesn't include Team Developer internal APLs. This is a very, very common mistake. In the past, users, developers would include Team Developer internal APLs into their application folder. For instance, if you're using Sybase and you're using ODBC and you include TD APLs into your application folder, this will be a problem if you have them there when migrating to Team Developer 5.2. Why? Because in Team Developer 5.2, our APLs, our internal APLs, have been modified to use the Unicode versions of the APIs that we call instead of the ANSI APIs that we call. So this is a big change, and if you have old TD APLs into your application folder, this will conflict with our new APLs, and you can get crashes, you can get compilation errors, you can get hangs in your application. So really make sure that no TD APLs exist in your application folder. Let the application pick them up from the TD installation folder. The next step is to convert all outlines, all application APK files and non-ActiveX APLs to text format. And I'll talk about ActiveX APLs later. So let's focus on APPs only at this time. So you will need to convert all of these outlines to text format. We provide a wizard from where you can do that. So you can use our migration wizard. It will automatically convert all binary files into TD 5.2 readable text in batch mode. So this wizard is available when you install TD. If you go to our Windows program item, you will see the TD migration wizard available there. So if you have a big application with many APPs, just go ahead and use the wizard to do the migration for you. And all that you will do is save those application files in text mode. Now, if you don't want to use the wizard, or if you only have a few files, you can do the same manually. You can open each binary file from your original TD version, make sure they can be compiled, and then just save as text format. That will do the same job as the migration wizard. Like I said, we're going to talk about ActiveX APLs in a few minutes. The next step is if you're using Dynalibs, those are our internal TD type of libraries. So if you're using Dynalibs, you will need to rebuild them, and their extension is APD. You will need to rebuild them from Team Developer 5.2. Now, this has always been the case. If you're migrating from any version of TD to any version of TD, you always have to rebuild your APDs because they need to be compiled and generated in the same version that you're migrating to. The next step is to load the main application in Team Developer 5.2. So now you have all your applications saved as text. You know you have done all the steps necessary to get to this point, so just open it from TD 5.2. Now, if you're using ActiveX, we'll take a look at a few extra steps. If you're not using ActiveX, you can just go ahead and compile your application. So let's say that you're using ActiveX libraries into your application. So you will need to regenerate them so they are all in the TD 5.2 format. Now, there are two ways of using ActiveX in your application. The first way is if you're using ActiveX graphical controls. For instance, the calendar control from Microsoft into your Team Developer 5.2 application. So if you're using an ActiveX graphical control, all you need to do is open a new instance of TD 5.2, create a new form, a dummy form, click the ActiveX control icon from the controls palette, drag and drop it on the form, and this will do it. This will automatically create a new interface library for this ActiveX control, and it will regenerate a new APL into your AXLibs folder into TD 5.2 installation. So with this, you are sure that you have regenerated your ActiveX library in the new TD 5.2 format. The other way of using ActiveX into your Team Developer application is by creating object libraries. And this is not a graphical control, but an automated library that you can create by going to the TD menu, Tools, ActiveX Explorer, and selecting the library that you want to generate the ActiveX APL for. So if you're using that type of automation, for instance, Microsoft Word or Microsoft Excel automation into Team Developer, in order to regenerate these libraries for the TD 5.2 format, all you need to do is follow the same steps. Go to TD menu Tools, ActiveX Explorer, select your library, select the required classes, and generate the new class using the Generate Full option. So at this point, again, you will have a new library into your AXLibs folder in the TD 5.2 format. Now I make a note here, and it's just a suggestion. Before you regenerate your ActiveX library, it's just a good practice that you remove the included library from the application outline. So you can just go to the Library tab and either comment or delete the reference to that application APL, and also delete the APL from your AXLibs folder before regenerating it. So this will avoid any conflict. You'll make sure that you're clean before regenerating the TD 5.2 ActiveX APL format. So make sure you do that just to avoid any confusion or any conflict between new and old ActiveX libraries. Now you're ready to compile your application. So you loaded your text format APL, you generated your ActiveX libraries, and you should be able to compile without any problems, without any errors at this point if you followed all those steps correctly. So if there's no errors, you can go ahead, proceed testing your application. Now sometimes, depending on your application and depending if you've migrated it before to another version of TD, you may receive errors related to old versions of Team Developer DLLs. So if you do this, if you have this kind of problem, if you receive this kind of error, we recommend that you follow the steps that I show into number 11 there, fix the old DLL reference problem. Now, there's a very easy method to do this, and this is just a test. We're not saying here go ahead and use your application as a merged outline. That's not what we're saying at all. This step will just ensure that you can have a full merged application outline where you can search for old references of DLLs. Once you find those old references, you can just go ahead and look into your application, APPs, APLs, APDs, and fix the problem. So this is just a step to find if you have any old references to DLLs in your application merged outline. So what you need to do, Open your application, go to the menu component, option merge libraries, click OK when we receive a message saying all included items will be converted. So this means that TD will get all your APPs, APLs, APDs code and merge everything into a single outline. Once you've done this, just save this merged outline as text. Use a new file name, of course, because you don't want to replace your original application. Then you can open this text file using any Unicode-enabled editor. So let's say, for instance, you have this merged base outline that you saved as text, and you want to open it from a notepad. Open it from Notepad and just do a search for .dll. If you find any references to old TD-DLLs, for instance, if you're using Quick Tabs and you find a reference to qtabI31.dll, you know there's a problem with your code. For some reason, it wasn't migrated correctly, or you probably had you were using quick objects and you had hard-coded the name of the quick object DLL into your attribute inspector. There are a few reasons why this may happen. So just go ahead, look into your outline, find this old reference and replace it by the new one. We should just say 5.52 instead of 3.1. We keep our DLL names the same throughout different TD versions. The only thing that changes is the last portion, which is the version number of the DLL. So just replace them in your original outline and you should be fine. You should stop receiving errors related to that, or crashes or hangs, because reference to old DLLs in the application usually cause GPF. If you see a very common type of error, which is there's not enough resource to open that window, this is usually due to old references of files into your application outline. So make sure you look for those if you are having similar problems to that. And this is just a screenshot. If you've never done this merge outline thing from your application, it's really, it's always been there. You just go to TD menu, component, merge libraries, and that's all you need. So this is just a screenshot demonstrating where to go in TD to make this kind of merge from your application outline. Okay, so you compile your application. You don't have any errors, so you're ready to run it in test mode now. Now, a few notes related to that. Because of Unicode implementation in 5.2, and depending on the type of application that you may have, there may be other extra steps involved. Now, it only means that you have to know about them and make decisions based on them. Usually, Unicode will not add anything else to your migration unless you're using very specific things that we'll talk about in the next slide. So I want to say 80% of the applications that customers have been migrated so far, they didn't need to change anything in their outline. Because the migration was just straightforward for them, but in a few situations, because of Unicode, there are a few extra steps involved, and you want to be aware of them just in case your application relates to that. So we'll talk about that in the next slide, but if you're good to go, if you compile your application and run in test mode correctly, you're ready now, you're ready to deploy your application and run your test in production and go live with your TD 5.2 outline. But let's go ahead and take a look at these Unicode changes so you can make decisions based on what your application uses and what your application and how your application was built. So let's do a quick overview of Unicode changes. The first item that I wanted to talk about is external function calls. Many TD applications use external function calls, and you have to ask yourself two questions. First one is, does your application call Windows APIs? If your application calls Windows APIs, it's important that you know that Microsoft provides Unicode versions for most of their APIs. So you might want to consider migrating your API calls to the Unicode mode. Do you have to do that? No. TD will work with Windows APIs. They're not Unicode. Now, do we recommend you to do that? Yes, we do. Because if you're calling Windows APIs that are already Unicode, you will avoid internal conversion from ANSI to Unicode when you're compiling and running your application. So think about your application, evaluate how many places you use Windows APIs, and it might be a good idea to change this Windows API call to the Unicode APIs that Microsoft provides. The other question you need to ask yourself is, does your application call third-party DLLs? And if so, is there a Unicode-enabled version of that DLL available that you can use, or do you have the source code available? If so, again, it's not a mandatory step. It's best that if you use the Unicode version of that DLL, you avoid internal conversion, etc. So, for instance, many customers use mtable as third-party DLL. Mtable has a Unicode version. It has a TD 5.2 version of that DLL. So contact your provider, contact your vendor, and they will provide that DLL for you. That's your best option. Still about external function calls. Some customers in the past have included our internal DLL, CDLLI 5.2.DLL, which is our runtime DLL into their application. So they did this, they included our internal runtime DLL, and they call APIs in that DLL, their SOL APIs. But in the past, all our SOL APIs were ASCII, and now they're Unicode. So we provide both ASCII and Unicode as opposed to before when we only provided ASCII versions of our SOL functions into our runtime DLL. So you need to decide if you want to convert entirely from ASCII to Unicode or not. Again, do you have to? No, you don't have to. You have an option. But if you decide to stay on ASCII and calling our ASCII versions of our SOL internal functions, there's one step that you need to do because by default, we are Unicode. So if you decide that you want to still use the ANSI call to those internal SOL functions in the runtime DLL, there's one change that you must do, and that is to go into your C project that defines the calls to those SOL functions and define a macro called TD ASCII in the project to force it to compile using the ASCII version of the SOL function instead of the Unicode one. Now, this is all documented, guys. This is all documented. When you install TD into our help files, you can find information, detailed information, and samples for all this. I'm just doing an overview here so you are aware of those changes and you can take action if necessary for your application. Another change related to Unicode and external function calls is that TD 5.2 is strict when it comes to external function call parameters. So in the past, if you defined an external function call from TD, sometimes if the number of parameters and returns didn't match the exact number of parameters and returns of its prototype, that wouldn't be a problem. But in TD 5.x, you will receive an error and it's a problem. So you must make sure that an external function call must match the exact number of parameters and returns of its prototype. Overview of Unicode changes related to Windows 32 APIs. I talked a little bit about this before. I said that it's best, not mandatory, but best that you use the Unicode version of the Windows 32 API calls provided by Microsoft if you're calling them from TD. And there's also new solve functions that you should use if you're calling and if you're creating and manipulating menus using Windows 32 APIs. So if your application uses Windows 32 APIs to create a menu, to delete and insert items and pictures into those menus, there are two new solve functions that you have to be aware. The first one is solve get menu to get the handle of a menu created with a Windows 32 API, and solve menu update to update that menu whenever you make changes to it using a Windows 32 API call. Again, this is all documented. Be aware that you may be changing your application code to use those functions if your menus are not being created and updated correctly from your TD 5.2 environment. We also added a new system variable called age frame, and the system variable is used to get the accessory frame window handle for creating and updating those menus. In TD 5.x, there's an extra layer on top of the parent form, and this is we call it the accessory frame. So sometimes, depending on how you created your application to deal with menus, you need to use this HWMD frame instead of the parent form frame to get to the handle of those menus. And again, this is all documented. We have samples related to that, so refer to those samples, refer to that documentation. The objective here is just to make sure you are aware of those changes, so when you migrate your code, you know where to go and what to do if your application uses those kinds of functionality. And I'm almost done. I think this is the last step on my overview of Unicode changes, and it's related to buffer handling. There are two functions related to buffer handling that existed in previous versions of TD. Those were called sol string set buffer length and sol string get buffer length. Those functions have been deprecated in Team Developer 5.2. You will still be able to use them, but you will receive a compilation error saying that this function has been deprecated. Please replace it with the two new sol functions, sol set buffer length and sol get buffer length. And quickly explaining the reason why we introduced these two new functions is because before in TD 5.1, we made a change in the way that the buffer was handled, and when a developer called the sol string get buffer length function to get the length of a buffer, because of Unicode, that length was multiplied by 2. But that was not a good change. Developers asked us to change it back to the way it worked before TD 5.1 version, so we introduced those two new functions which behave exactly the same as before. So the only change you need to do is change the function name, nothing else. The buffer length that you set and the buffer length that you get are exactly the same values as in previous TD versions. So to avoid that confusion from TD 5.1 Service Pack 2 on, we introduced those two new functions. You can just replace the old names by the new ones, and you're good to go. So like I said before, all those changes have been documented. We have samples, and we also have archived webinars explaining in detail all those changes and all those extra steps if your application requires them. So we have archived webinars on migrating external functions, on dealing with Windows 32 API, Unicode calls, Unicode database access. So if your application uses those functions, please go ahead, take a look at those archived webinars because they explain in detail all I talked about in this presentation now as a quick overview. And I have a URL, a link on my slide. This is where you have to go if you want to access those archived webinars. We also have tons of new functionality and features introduced in Team Developer 5.2. So after you migrate your outline, as described in this presentation, go ahead and look at our documentation for what's new in Team Developer 5.2, what's new in Service Pack 1, because there are new functionality, new features that you can just go ahead and start introducing in your application after you successfully migrated your outline. We have new grid functionality. We have improved Informix Unicode support if you're using Informix. We've added ability to include images, embed them into executables. We've updated CDK to be able to use all the new objects, grids, switch text, tab controls, etc., much more. So after you successfully migrate your outline, go ahead, take a look at the new functionality. I'm sure you see lots of advantages of things that you have that you can include in your application to make it look more modern and more appealing to your end users. And this ends my presentation.
All right, great. So we'll open it up for the Q&A now. And again, just use the question mark button on your WebEx toolbar. We'll go silent for a minute, give you a chance to post your questions. We'll come back on then and start reading through them. All right, we're going to come back on and start going through the questions. The first question is, if we do not go Unicode and stay ASCII, does this affect performance?
I believe you're talking about the external functions and the CD and the TD runtime DLL, because I just wanted to make clear that there's no way not to go Unicode. If you're using Team Developer 5.2, you are in the Unicode world. So I believe you're asking about the external function calls and runtimes that I talked about during my presentation. So if that's the case, we haven't heard of any performance decrease because of that. The impact is not big. It's just that there will be a Unicode conversion done internally. but we haven't heard of any performance decrease because of that. It shouldn't be a big problem. We haven't heard about it. That's what I want to say. So it shouldn't be a big problem in terms of performance of your application executable.
All right. Next question. Do you offer services around migration to 5.2 from older releases? The short answer to that is yes. There's a couple different ways you can go. We do offer consulting services to help somebody migrate. We've done that for several customers, and it just depends on the complexity of the application. In some cases, it's just a few days of services, and the customer's set with their migration. But also, if you have technical support, depending on what kind of assistance you're looking for, tech support, if you have a tech support subscription, they've been very helpful as well, because the migration is, there's this step-by-step that Anna has laid out. They can also help when you have a tech support agreement. Next question. We're attempting to migrate our web application to 5.2 and have encountered a few issues. I have open tickets for them and they are being worked on. Can we move to Service Pack 1 with the trial version? We want to make sure it works first.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. You can move to Service Pack 1 with trial, and I would actually recommend you to do that. There's the Service Pack 1 link available on the website. Can be applied on top of the TD 5.2 full release, on top of the trial, etc. So yes, absolutely you can, and you should. And if you have any issues downloading that service pack or installing, just let us know.
Great. And just to add on to that, for those of you that don't know, for a lot of our products, we make the trial version available. It's a 45-day trial version. It's a full working version of the product. So it's not like it's just some part enabled. So absolutely, you can do everything you need, I think, with the trial version.
Yeah. And if you don't have TD 5.2 yet, if you go to the download page, we have a download which is TD 5.2, which includes Service Pack 1. So you can just install that one, and you will be on the latest service pack for TD 5.2 in a one single install. You don't have to install TD 5.2 first and then the service pack. You can just download and install TD 5.2, including the service pack from the website.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. In other words, we are including Service Pack 1 in the 5.2 download now. So if you don't already have a 5.2, and you do the trial download, the service pack's included.
Correct.
Okay, great. All right, next question. How can I get a copy of the presentation? Well, there's two ways. One is we'll make a recorded version of this webinar available on the website, and that should be available by the beginning of next week. And that's the best way, because not only do you get the presentation, but you get Anna's wonderful voice and content behind all those bullets on the slides. So that's one way. But if you would like a copy of the PowerPoint itself, that is possible as well. You just need to get in touch with your Unify representative, and they'll be able to get you a copy of it. All right, next question. I'm interested in 6.0. Do I have to migrate to 5.2 in order to migrate to 6.0 when it comes out? So the short answer to that, I'll give a little bit, and then Anna, I'm sure, will add on to it, is no. You do not have to go to 5.2 first in order to get to 6.0. It's going to be the same 13 steps that she outlined, whichever way you go. If, however, one thing you may want to consider is, if you are very anxious about getting to the .NET capabilities that are going to be available with the 6.0 release, and you want to start using those as soon as possible, I can't tell you how many requests I've had from people, well, can't 6.0 come out, or can't you make it come out earlier so we can start using it? We do recommend that you go to 5.2 now to get all of these steps out of the way, and that way you can start taking advantage of the .NET capabilities and the new features as soon as 6 comes out.
Absolutely, absolutely. If you go to the TD 5.2 right now, it will make your life much easier when you move to 6.0 because you will have the outline ready to go. You have your new functionality that we included in TD 5.2 that we're just adding to it in 6.0. So if you get ready now, you will be prepared for when 6.0 comes out, and your migration will be much, much faster if you are in the 5.2 release as opposed to previous versions of TD.
In fact, like going to 6.0 from 5.2 is basically, it's much minor. I mean, it's not like all these steps you have to go through, right?
No, it's for instance, for people that went to TD 5.1 and they're going to 5.2 right now, it's just a matter of opening your outline, loading it in TD, exactly like we did for old versions. So that would be the same in 6.0. You'll be able to open your outline in 6.0 without taking any further steps if you're already in TD 5.2.
Great. All right. Any other questions? Let me see here. I think that's all the questions that we have right now. Let me look. We're going to double check on the chat side. It looks like it. Oh, actually, let's scroll down right here. Yeah, that's it. All right. So if you still have any questions, feel free to post them. But what we'll do is we'll start closing down the webinar now. So first of all, Anna and I want to thank you for participating in the webinar today. We hope you found it useful and informational. When you exit out of the webinar, you'll get a little like 5-question survey type of thing. It takes 30 seconds to do. We encourage you to do that. Let us know what you liked, what you didn't like. Was it what you expected? And are there any future topics in particular you'd like to see us do? We use those to drive these monthly webinars. And we do almost every month a webinar on a team developer topic. So do let us know. Just to give you a heads up on some of the upcoming events, we're doing a bunch of developer conferences in Latin America. In fact, Anna will be going down there for all of those. So for any of you that are down south, it's a chance to meet with her in person and talk about your upgrade questions or TD questions in general. And she has a lot of great content. It's not just Anna that's going to be down there, but Anna is doing a lot of the presentations, and she's got a lot of great content on all the new features in the 5.2 release. She'll be demoing the 6.0 product. So just a lot of great stuff to see. You see the additional resources. We do have an online store where you can purchase Report Builder, you can purchase SQL Base, and you can purchase Q. Also, she mentioned the link on our unify.com website. If you go to the news and events, that's where you can get to the archived webinars, and that's how you will get to this one when it's available by probably Monday. And then we do have upcoming webinars. We have one tomorrow on SQL-based Treasury. For those of you that are SQL-based users, you might be interested to check that out. And we will have webinars next month as well that you'll receive email invites to for Team Developer. All right, well, that's all we have. Thanks, and have a great day.